What's going on, guys? It's CTA Prime back here again. Today we're going to be putting together a $350 gaming PC. This is going to be a three-part series. The first part, the video you're watching now, is the build. The next video in the series will be benchmarking this unit, testing out some gameplay and applications to see how this thing performs. And then finally, for part 3, we'll add a dedicated GPU to this system so we can up the game. So if you're watching this in the future, make sure you check the description for part 2 and 3. So basically what we have here is a $350 lower end gaming PC with tons of upgradability down the road. For instance, you can always add a dedicated GPU to a system like this, or you could upgrade the CPU down the road to a 2600 or a 2700 Ryzen. But for this build, we're going to be using the Ryzen 3 2200G APU. This CPU comes in at $99 and recently it was on sale for $80 on Amazon. This has 4 cores with 4 threads, base clock of 3.5 GHz, boost clock of 3.7, 4 MB of L3 cache, and an onboard Radeon Vega 8 GPU, with the clock up to 1100 MHz, and we can overclock the CPU and GPU portion of this unit quite a bit. I will leave Amazon links in the description for everything I'm using here. Tons of motherboard options for a chip like this, and these micro ATX boards go for around the same price, $75 I chose the Gigabyte B450M DS3H. I've just personally had really good luck with Gigabyte motherboards, that's why I chose this. And if you're searching around for a better price motherboard, you're going to run across the B350s. I would stay away from them because the older ones that came off the floor aren't updated for the Ryzen APUs. You will have to get a compatible CPU, then upgrade the BIOS. You're better off starting with a B450. These Ryzen APUs perform much better with faster RAM, so I'm using 3000 MHz Vengeance LPX. This is 8 GB, 2 4 GB sticks. I picked this up for $58 on Amazon recently, but unfortunately the price on this has gone up to about $70, so I'm recommending something else here. Same amount of RAM, same speed, it's just made by Patriot. This is the Viper 4 series, 3000 MHz. $58. You're definitely going to want to add more storage down the road, but to get you started, you can always use a 240 GB Kingston A400 SSD. These come in at $30, and I've had really good luck with these drives. You could always add a couple of these drives or just use this drive for your Windows 10 installation and use a 1 TB Western Digital Blue 3.5. They're relatively cheap, but for this build, we're trying to keep the price down, so I'm going to be going with this. For the case, I chose the Thermaltake Versa H17. Now this doesn't have any tempered glass on it. You could always splurge and get something that looks a little better, but I love the minimalistic design of this. I don't need any flashy RGB on my PC at all. This will get the job done. It's a tough case, and I think it looks pretty sleek. And finally, the power supply. I went with a 500 watt Thermaltake because we will be adding a dedicated GPU to the system later on down the road. If you're not planning on adding a dedicated GPU, you can get away with a 150 watt power supply with the 2200G. 500 watts is definitely overkill just for this APU, but if you want to do any upgrading down the road, I do recommend at least a 400 watt. Total cost on this full build, $347 Now you could get out a little cheaper, about $30 if you go with a power supply case combo from Newegg, but personally I wanted a decent looking case and I wanted my power supply to last more than a year and a half. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and put this thing together. So like always, we're going to be starting with the motherboard here. This is a Gigabyte B450M DS3H. There's not a lot of bells and whistles here, but this will definitely get us by with gaming and everyday tasks. It's plenty for what we need. We do have PCIe X16, and like I mentioned, this is a 3-part series. We will be utilizing this to its fullest later on down the road. We also have X1 and X4. This board does contain an M.2 slot for an M.2 SSD if you want to use that, but for me I'm going to be using a 2.5-inch SSD, so we're not going to be using that in this video. As for the I.O., we have our audio in and out, 2 USB 2.0 ports, gigabit Ethernet, 4 USB 3.0 ports, HDMI, DVI, a PS2 port, and 2 more USB 2.0 ports. The first thing we want to start with is the CPU. Now these boards come with the older AM4 mounting bracket system. We will have to remove this, so you're going to need a Phillips head screwdriver. Since we're using the included Wraith cooler, it's not going to support that old mounting system. On the back of the board, you will notice this steel mounting plate. We're going to need to keep this in place. It will detach from the board when we remove the old mounting brackets, But first thing I want to do is place the CPU in the socket. So I'm just going to raise up the locking lever. And remember, the CPU only goes in one way. On the socket itself, there is a little arrow. We're going to need to line up this arrow with the arrow that's located on the CPU itself. It's really easy to do. Got a close-up here for you. So just make sure you have the arrows lined up. This is a drop-in socket. No force whatsoever is required. You're just going to drop it right in. And we're going to close the lever. The CPU is now inserted into the motherboard. Now I'm going to remove the old AM4 bracketing system because, like I said, we're using the Wraith cooler. It's just 4 Phillips head screws, and the back plate is going to remain in place as long as we have this on a steady surface. And now it's time for our CPU cooler. These do come with pre-applied thermal paste, and I recommend using that. But I've previously used this cooler and CPU, so I've cleaned up the old thermal paste that was on this. And I'll be using some Noctua NTH2 thermal paste. I've tried Thermal Grizzly, I've tried a lot of them. I personally prefer this, plus I had a couple tubes left over. I personally use a little dab in the middle, never had any issues, built tons of different systems. You'll find thousands and thousands of different ways to apply your thermal paste, but I find that this is the easiest, and in my experience, the most effective. Mounting the cooler is relatively easy, but with these Wraith coolers, there's a little nub on the side here with the AMD logo. Sometimes, on some motherboards, it will block off a RAM slot. So I'm going to be placing it to the left-hand side of the board. You can try it either way, but it only goes 2 ways. It'll go to the right or to the left. I'm just going to line up 2 of the screws on the cooler with 2 of the studs on the back plate on the upper side of the motherboard. When I place it down, the other 2 should be lined up. Now when tightening this down, you don't need to use a lot of force. I usually place a little bit of force at first, and I start all 4 screws. I do this in a cross pattern, so I have everything evenly snugged down. The cooler is now mounted. It's time to plug in the CPU fan. On pretty much every motherboard, you will have a CPU fan labeled connector. That's where I'm going to plug this right into. I'm going to try to tidy up the length of this cable a little bit, and it looks pretty good. Now it's time to insert our RAM. Like I mentioned, I'm using this Corsair Vengeance LPX 3000 MHz DDR4 RAM. As you can see, there are 4 slots on this board, but we're only going to be utilizing 2 of them for dual channel. On every board, it will be marked. I'm not sure if you can see it here, but the RAM slots are numbered. So we have number 1, number 3, number 2, and number 4. Basically, if you're only using 2 RAM sticks, you want number 1 and 2. So on this board, we're going to be using the 2 gray slots. The RAM can only be inserted one way, so make sure you have the notch in the middle lined up. You will have to apply a little bit of force, just make sure the notch is lined up. When it's inserted completely and correctly, the notches will lock in place. So that's it. We now have our CPU, our cooler, and our RAM installed. That's pretty much all we need to do for the motherboard outside of the case. We still have a little ways to go, but we need to move the case in because we have to mount the motherboard in the case before we do anything else. Alright, so now it's time to mount the motherboard inside of the case. I've taken both panels off. This is the front, and this is the rear of the case, if that's how you want to look at it. You will have a mess of wires back here. This is our front I/O or USB, power button reset, LEDs, all that good stuff. You're also going to need to locate the mounting hardware that came with your case. This is everything we need to mount the motherboard inside of the case. It even comes with some extra zip ties and our SSD mounts. This particular case just came with a couple bags. Some cases come with boxes mounted inside of a hard drive bay, so look around if you can't find it. It should be there. I usually just separate these out so I have easy access to them. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Then we'll mount this motherboard. Again, you're going to need a Phillips head screwdriver for this. We're also going to need to find the motherboard I/O plate. So this is going to go in the back of the case, and we kind of want to make sure we have it lined up correctly. So just take a look at how you're going to mount it. This just pops into the opening on the back side of the case. Make sure you're not putting pressure on the middle of the plate, but on the outer edges. So this still isn't in there. I'm going to hold the case itself, kind of snap it in. There we go. So my I/O plate is now installed. It's time to install the motherboard. So I just get all of the cables out of the way. In the front here, we only have this rear fan cable to worry about. We will plug this in after we get everything mounted up. I'm going to grab the motherboard by the heatsink itself, place it in here. Make sure you have the I/O lined up with all of the ports on the board. This one fits really nice in here. The studs actually have these little protrusions, so they come up through the mounting holes on the board. So when everything's in place, you should definitely know it. Now it's just a matter of bolting the motherboard down. So you might not use every single hole on the motherboard itself. Some cases will utilize all of them. This one here only uses 5. The board's not going to go anywhere. 5 screws in here is going to be plenty to hold this in place. And just like every other screw on this PC, just snug it down. You do not need to torque them down super tight. So now that your motherboard's mounted, it's time to install the power supply. I mean, you could really do this in any order, but I usually put the motherboard in first, then I install the power supply. Now it's time to mount the power supply. I hate these non-modular power supplies, but if you want to get by cheap, you're probably going to have to use one unless you find a really good sell on the EVGA 550B. Your power supply and motherboard should come with mounting hardware. It'll just be 4 screws to hold this in place. You're also going to need a Phillips head screwdriver. With this case, the power supply is going to be mounted on the lower level. Some people refer to this as a power supply basement. The PSU fan will be facing down. The case itself does have a little mesh filter on the bottom to catch a little bit of dust. It's not the best in the world, but it should help out. We're just going to slide it right in the compartment here. And this power supply does have a few different mounting holes. You're just going to want to line it up and put your 4 screws in. I mean, it's really as simple as that. Like I've mentioned several times, this doesn't need to be super tight. You don't want to strip anything out. Now that the power supply is mounted, we're going to go ahead and get all of the cables ready. For now, we're going to be focusing on 2 main cables. The 24-pin power, or 20+4, whatever you want to call it. This will go right into the motherboard. And we'll also need our 8-pin CPU power. So if we take a look at the case up in the top right-hand corner, if you're looking at it from the back, there should be a little cutout. We're going to slide our CPU power cable in here. And as for the 30-pin, it really depends on where the 30-pin is located on your board when it's mounted in the case. Basically, they should be all in the same place, but you might have different cutouts on your case. So as you can see, I slid mine.
What's going on, guys?
First hole.
CTA Prime
back here again. Today we're going to be putting together a $350 gaming
That way
PC.
we can get right
This is going to be a 3-part series. The first part, the video you're watching now, is on the back of the board. The next video in the series will be benchmarking this unit, testing out some gameplay and applications to see how this thing performs. And then finally, as for the 8-pin, we'll add a dedicated GPU corner of the motherboard. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So if you're watching this in the future, make sure you check the description for part 2 and 3.
Top left-hand corner.
So basically, what we have here is a $350
lower.
You really don't want to crimp
them, but bending them is not
tons of upgradability down the road.
We're going to plug this right into the 8-pin.
You can always add a dedicated GPU to a system like this,
or you could upgrade the CPU
down the road.
As for the rest of the cabling, I do recommend taking a look at your motherboard's user manual.
But for this build, we're going to be using the Ryzen 3 2200
this here. This is going to be my system fan, my rear fan.
The CPU comes in at $99, and recently it was on sale for $80 on Amazon. This has 4 cores with 4 threads, base clock of 3.5 gigahertz, boost clock.
Now this is an easy part, but it's very
4 megabytes of L3
plug in
cache,
all of our front I/O.
and an onboard.
This is really hard for me to
Vega
capture
8
on camera, but
with
they're
the clock
clearly
up
marked
to 1100
on the board,
megahertz.
on the connectors,
and we can
and in your
overclock the
manual.
CPU
When plugging in your LEDs, they are polarity sensitive, so you need positive to positive and negative to negative. As for the power button and reset switch,
tons of motherboard options for a chip like this,
you can plug them
micro
in either
ATX
way.
boards go for around the same
wires
price.
around that we haven't unwrapped yet.
I chose the Gigabyte B450M DS3H.
Well, here they are.
I've just personally had really good luck with Gigabyte motherboards,
and
USB 2.0 connectors. And if you're searching around for a better price motherboard, you're going to run across the B350.
A case like this is
away
actually
from them
decent
because
at
the
cable
older
management.
ones that came off
Now
the
remember,
floor
you're going to want to take a look at the front and the back to know where you want to route your cables.
You will have to get a compatible CPU.
It's on the bottom
BIOS
left-hand corner.
You're better off starting with a B450.
So I'm going to run it in through this back.
These Ryzen APUs perform much better with faster RAM, so I'm using 3000 megahertz Vengeance LPX. This is
the rest of the cabling, like my USB
4 gigabyte
3.0,
sticks.
my
I
power
picked this up for
button,
$58 on Amazon
LED,
recently,
and
but
power
unfortunately
LED
the
will
price
be
on
run
this
through
has gone
the
up to
front
about
cutout
$70. So I'm recommending something else.
Like I said, everything
same
should be
amount of
clearly
RAM,
marked.
same
The
speed.
connectors,
It's
the
just made
motherboard,
by
and you can
Patriot.
also
This is the
reference
Viper
your user
4
manual.
series, 3000 megahertz.
So here's a quick look at everything connected.
You're definitely going to want to add more storage down the road, but to get you started, you can always use a 240 gigabyte Kingston A400 SSD.
It's super easy,
These
but
come in
very
at
tedious.
$30.
And remember, the LEDs are polarity sensitive, so put your negative to negative.
You could always add a couple of these drives, or just use this drive for your Windows 10 installation and use a 1 terabyte Western Digital Blue 3.5.
We're getting real close to being finished here, but for this build, we're trying to keep the price down. I'm using this 240 gigabyte Kingston SSD.
For the case, I chose the Thermaltake
with hardware for
this, and there are several
this
different
doesn't have any
tempered glass on it.
This case uses a sliding grommet system for these SSDs,
but I love the minimalistic design of this. I don't need any flashy RGB on my PC at all. This will get the job done. It's a tough case, and I think it looks pretty
slide
sleek.
it into place. And finally, the power supply. I went with a 500 watt Thermaltake because we will be adding a dedicated GPU. Your motherboard should have come with a couple SATA cables.
If you're not planning on adding a dedicated GPU, you can get away with a 150 watt power supply with the 2200.
I just routed my SATA cable, plugged it into the unit,
just for this
and
APU,
power from the power supply to the SSD.
Down the road, I do recommend at least a 400 watt. Total cost on this full
all this
build,
left to do is triple check your connections and a little bit of cable management around
could
back.
Get out a little
then
cheaper, about
$30. For cable management, I use zip ties, but when I run out, I also use the twisty ties.
Personally,
that came on
I wanted a decent looking case, and now it's time for the moment of truth. We need to boot this thing up, but we're also going to have to install
with all that out of the way,
let's go ahead and put this thing together. I'm choosing Windows 10. Recently, I made a video on how to create a Windows 10 installation USB drive, so I'll leave a link for that in the description. Got mine set up. Not a lot of bells and whistles here, but this will definitely get us by.
So I have quadruple checked all of my connections.
It's plenty for what we're good to go.
We do have PCIe automatically boot, and like I mentioned, this is a 3-part series. We will be utilizing this to its fullest later on down the road. We also have X1 and X4.
This board does contain an M.2 slot. I just need to install Windows 10. I do like to be connected online while I'm installing this, so it downloads most of my updates, but I will have to go to the manufacturer's website. As for the I/O, we have our audio in and out, the graphics USB 2.0 ports,
so I got Windows 10 installed,
4 USB 3.0 ports, HDMI, DVI, a PS2 port, and 2 more USB 2.0 ports.
Mechanical keyboard with blue switches.
The first thing we want to start with is the CPU. Now these boards come with the older AM4 mounting brackets. I'm using a Corsair M65 Pro. This is a great mouse. It's relatively cheap.
Since we're using the included rate
on
cooler,
Amazon,
it's not going to support that
aluminum
mouse
pad here. It's a no-name
on the back of the board. You will notice this steel mounting plate. If you've never used a good mouse, you will be surprised at how it will detach from the board when we remove the old mounting brackets.
Like I was saying, I want to do is install some drivers, so I head over to my motherboard's
so I'm just going to raise up the locking lever,
find my motherboard.
Remember, the CPU only goes in one way.
I also
on
like
the socket itself, there is a little arrow, and then I download my graphics arrow with the arrow that's located
in this
on the
case. We're using the 2200G, so we head over to AMD's website for you. Choose processor.
So just make sure you have the arrows lined up.
Find 2200G.
This is a drop-in socket, no force whatsoever is required.
Driver for this.
Just going to drop it right in.
Now we can start installing our favorite Steam games. So that's pretty much it for
CPU
part
is now
1. We
inserted
have a fully
into the
built
motherboard.
PC
now
with Windows 10 installed.
We're up and running now.
System because, in part 2, I will be doing some benchmarking. I'm going to test out a bunch of games, some applications, and the backplate is going to remain in place as long as we have this running on this. Let me know in the comments below. Really appreciate you guys watching. Definitely keep an eye on the channel for part 2 and 3.
Thermal paste,
and I also have tons of links for Amazon and Newegg in the description.